Welcome, compadres. Please take a seat, form a circle around me. Today is the 17th of May, and we're going to be talking about something fitting for this date because today is a day of change, it's a day of mutation, of revolution. Across the centuries, on this day, you've gotten things like the 7 Years' War, started by, of course, perfidious Albion declaring war against the French. You had Napoleon of France annexing the Papal States. You had the Principality of Monaco changing from French to Austrian-controlled occupation. You had the second ever constitution, democratic constitution installed in Norway after the one from the United States. You had Germany taking control of Brussels in Belgium. This was also the day where Zaire officially renamed itself to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Congo for short. Given we have a day filled with changes and revolutions across the world, across time, we are talking about some revolution in this game. What revolution, you might ask? Well, it was in the title and in the thumbnail, so if you clicked, you are probably already guessing what this is about, right? It's about outdated specs. It's about old and rusty specs that play badly, that should be updated, should be renewed to a more modern, a more enthralling and a more entertaining playstyle that haven't kept up with the time and that should be given a little bit more of a polish. Now, before we start looking at these specs I selected personally as my to-go specs, you have to remember that this has nothing to do with how powerful a spec is or how strong it is, or even if it is playing badly currently. And to give you a benchmark as an example of what I mean, Subtlety Rogue. Right now, Subtlety Rogue is not very powerful, it's not doing very well. That doesn't mean it's an old spec, it doesn't mean it's an outdated spec, it doesn't mean it's doing badly also because the spec is bad to play. It's just, in that case, purely a matter of numbers. It's got nothing to do with how the spec plays. On a similar note, you also have Beast Mastery Hunter, for example, not doing great. Destruction Warlock, not doing great either. Those specs are just fine. They are updated, they are modern enough, they don't really need a complete overturn of their entire kit because it doesn't work anymore. They are simply low in numbers, they are simply low in tuning. I don't think anyone would have batted an eye if instead of Affliction, this tier you had Destruction being powerful. Like, it's fine. It's a normal spec, it's fine to play. That's not one of the specs we're going to be looking for today. These are going to be broken specs, ugly specs. I also thought it was worth making this video because these specs are not talked about often, because some of these are not going to be played very often as well, and it might be because of this reason. We are starting, of course, with the first one that we have to go through just to spend some time talking about this, which is Survival Hunter. Okay, I know what you're saying, and this is also what I would be saying as a default answer to how do we fix Survival Hunter. The answer is stop making it a fucking melee spec. It doesn't work, people don't like it, they're not gonna play it, it's not gonna be popular, especially as long as you have equally or more useful ranged hunter specs. The way you have developed the raids, Blizzard, is that ranged DPS specs are more useful, or at the very least create less problems for your raid, for the mechanics that need to be handled. So as long as melee DPS are in the minority, there's not gonna be a reason to bring a Survival Hunter. But if for a second we assumed that being a melee DPS wasn't a problem, if for a second we assume that you wouldn't necessarily want ranged hunters over melee hunters, then what is the problem for survival? Well, first of all, as I pointed out in my fun rating videos for specs, survival is not particularly entertaining. Survival with its priority system, its rotation, is pretty boring. It's not very innovative. It's not been very innovative, even though it was a spec effectively created in Legion. So it's not very old. It's pretty new. So Blizzard should have looked at this spec with modern eyes, with fresh eyes. At the end of the day, Survival was born as a melee spec at the same time as Vengeance and Havoc Demon Hunter, right? The main problem is that Survival spends over 70% of its time casting Raptor Strike and casting Kill Command. This is annoying, this is problematic, it's not really very entertaining. You could have some entertainment if Mongoose Bite was still a viable usage of a talent, because Mongoose Bite has the whole thing where you want to spam it so that you can increase the damage it does. So you do have that kind of feel good situation where you can pull your resources and have enough to spam that mongoose bite. But when you don't even have that, and you're just left spamming your generator and spamming your spender for over 70% of your buttons, it feels boring. You also have this weird thing with your pet, where you're not a Beast Mastery Hunter, but you still make use of your pet, and basically 40% of your time is spent using Kill Command. Now, what can you say about a spec when Beast Mastery Hunter takes less time and spends less time clicking Kill Command than a Survival Hunter does? It just feels out of place. It feels like it's not planned very thoroughly of a spec. Why do you still have a pet as survival? Why do you still have to spend so much time using buttons for your pet? It just doesn't feel like a very coherent and cohesive spec compared to the other two. Plus, and now we have to go back to reality, where being a melee DPS spec is a negative. Plus, you also have to drop on top of these negatives the fact that it's a melee spec, the fact that you have your bigger brothers, marksmanship and beast mastery, bullying you every day. So it cannot continue like this. We cannot go another tier, and then another tier, and then another expansion expecting anything to change for survival. There is no amount of change to your talents or change to your new legendaries that is going to change the way people feel about survival as long as it is in this state. As long as it keeps taking bits and pieces from marksmanship and beast mastery like Kill Command, like Serpent Sting, and just reuse them, it's just not gonna work. I think it needs to be reworked. Of course, in the mind of everyone, the better rework, regardless of the plans of Blizzard, would be to make it a ranged DPS spec again. Now, another spec I want to see changed, I want to see removed from the game and then re-released as a completely different one is Frost Mage. So, we're going over a ranged DPS spec now, and what is interesting about Frost Mage is that despite being pretty bad, it is still almost on par with the badness of Arcane Mage. Surprisingly enough, while being a very popular class over time, ever since vanilla, it still had some pretty bad playstyles in two of their specs. Fire has kind of gotten away with this minigame around combustion. Okay, we can give you that, it's fine, but Frost, the spec is bad. Like, what in the fuck is this? This is even worse, actually much worse, than what Survival Hunter does. You are spending nearly 80% of your time clicking two buttons, which is Frostbolt and Ice Lance, and even more so, nearly the remaining of your time is spent with Flurry. It is just so outdated, so old. Frost is like the most vanilla, the most TBC caster we have right now. It's the closest one to what we had in the old days. Frost is essentially hostage. It has been kidnapped and now has been taken at gunpoint by these two criminals. That's right, Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze are effectively enemies of mankind. They are hunted worldwide by good gameplay authorities. They are an abomination which has tortured Frost Mage for far too many years, far too many expansions and raid tiers. The spec as a whole is basically completely on its knees, having to depend on these two procs. And even when these two things proc, all they are going to do is empower and essentially give you more ways to press Ice Lance. They don't really do anything interesting either. You're basically spamming Frostbolt hoping to get some Fingers of Frost so you can click Ice Lance, or you're spamming Frostbolt so you have a chance to get Brain Freeze so you can cast Flurry instant. That's it, on repeat. It's just so bad. It's so unsatisfying, it's so old. Frost needs some extra abilities, or if you don't want to add extra abilities, at least rework some of them. At least make Flurry, maybe even Frozen Orb, work a different way, or maybe introduce Icicles or something interacting with Icicles as an actual ability. Make it so that Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze are not this oppressive across the whole spec when you're playing it. Otherwise, it's going to continue to be a very, very boring spec. Awful. I pity all mages whenever there is a tier where we know Frost is going to become meta and everyone has to play it, because it is just so disappointing to play and outdated, so it's time for a change. Now, talking about changes, now we are going back to another melee spec, and now we are going to the boomer corner of melee, because we're going to go across a couple of them. Assassination and Feral, who have kind of both the same problems. We have gone over this when we were talking about the speed of the specs, and then we've gone over this when we were talking about the fun element of the specs. So, starting with Assassination. Assassination is the least problematic of the two. It does have some ways out. Yeah, some people right now might feel like it's also better to play simply because it's doing more damage, simply because it is stronger right now. So it always gives you a better feeling when you're playing a stronger spec, even if it plays boringly. But as you can see, effectively Assassination is still pretty slow and pretty repetitive. It does have a pretty significant chunk of waiting time where you're literally, not really doing much of anything other than auto-attacking. On top of this, you have Mutilate, which is a very large portion of your time. It has one of the largest spent times when it comes to pressing your generator ability of any spec. We just went through one of the spec that beats them, which is Frost Mage with their Frostbolt spam. And then after Frostbolt, Mutilate spam is a candidate for the amount of time you're spending pressing this ability. The spec has been simplified quite a bit over time, which is what I am addressing here. I would like the spec to become a little bit more satisfying, where you can pull off some of its nice plays, because right now you can just garrote on cooldown, you can reapply Rapture when you are inside the pandemic window, and then just continue to fill your combo points and spend them with Envenom without really much of any other change. Most of the other abilities are not being used almost any time. You have Ambush when you are in stealth, those few times that you are in. Slice and Dice has become basically not even needed to be casted or to be kept track of, because it's just going to refresh itself automatically, so you have even less planning to do required. There is basically no snapshotting anymore with your dots as Assassination, so you lost a vast portion of the big brain thinking required to play Assassination, which is why I think is a spec that requires some bit of polish. It's not a rework, it's not a broken spec like I think Frost Mage is. It does require, though, some more modern addition to the way the spec works. Some little bits and pieces here and there, maybe dot damage buffs on cooldowns, some snapshotting coming back, allowing you to gain more benefits, allowing you to get more damage if you correctly plan your cooldowns, if you correctly plan your combo points and your energy, and you can do a decent rotation, a decent combo that feels satisfying and rewarding to pull off, which is something you don't really have right now. Moving to its sister spec, to its brother spec, which is Feral Druid, because they work, of course, very similarly. Both specs are very slow. Both specs have a decent amount of waiting time where they do nothing. Both specs have the same function of applying a couple of dots and then spending the rest of your combo points in a damage finisher. Feral Druid has gotten better performance throughout this first tier because they were carried, that's the word, carried by Convoke the Spirits. They were essentially given very strong single target burst. They were even given a proxy good AoE because they can take Balance Affinity, switch into Moonkin form, and then use Convoke the Spirits, and unironically do more damage as a Boomkin than a Feral Druid, fishing for the Full Moon and the Starfall casts, which is depressing to think of. And the spec just works very similarly. You have your couple of dots, just like Garrote and Rapture, you have Rip and Rake, and then you have your Envenom, which is your Ferocious Bite. Your only extra, your only addition is your new AoE talents where you are taking Brutal Slash. So you're just adding a Brutal Slash to your rotation, but the result doesn't change. Feral Druid has the biggest, by a long shot, the biggest amount of waiting time, amount of literally AFK and don't press anything time of any spec, on average 80 seconds on a 5-ish minute fight, which is massive. It's just terrible, and something needs to be done about that. It's just too big. It's just too glaring, especially the difference when compared to other specs is just too large. I don't think the spec as a whole is that bad to play, particularly in AoE. This is a classic of dot specs. They become more frantic, more hectic, and more engaged when you have to keep track of multiple targets because of your multiple dots, right? And on single target is not too bad either, but similar to Assassination, although not to that extent. They have also lost a lot, if not most, of their chances of snapshotting dots, of using important cooldowns to frame abilities to do extra damage, like their Tiger's Fury they still have, but it is weaker and works more simply than what they had before. They are not using Savage Roar as a staple anymore. It's just a useless talent that is never picked, so their complexity has also gone down. It doesn't mean that if a spec is not complex, it should be bad. At the end of the day, I'm not going to put into my list of renovation for specs, I'm not going to put Havoc here, I'm not going to put Marksmanship here, I'm not putting Arms Warrior here, so it's not that I have something for specs that are simple to play, but I think that all those specs have something in return while being simple. You know, Arms can be very fast, Havoc can be very fast, Marksmanship at the very least as a continuous loop of 3 abilities more or less that they keep repeating, whereas Feral, not only is it a little bit boring like those specs, but it's also very slow. And it's not slow because you have a big brain, it's not slow because you are carefully planning like a master general. Every move, like the battlefield is a chessboard, you're literally AFK. Waiting for your energy to pull up, waiting for your cooldowns, or to have enough energy for your Blood Talons combo, which is not entertaining, it's not engaging, so I want to see it changed for Feral. Feral is in a similar situation to Survival, which is just a naturally unpopular spec. So just slightly retuning the talent tree, for example, or adding or removing 1 or 2 abilities from their core kit is likely not going to change much. People are still going to mostly ignore Feral, which is why they would need, you know, a renovation, a relaunch of the spec as a whole to make it more appealing to players. And now we are moving to the last of the caster specs and also the last of the DPS specs as a whole, which is Arcane Mage. So, of all of the caster specs, my only 2 bad specs that I would want to see changed and updated are just 2 of the mage specs. I think Elemental, Shadow, Balance, all of the Warlock specs are doing fine. They are playable, they have different styles for different players. I don't think for myself, for example, Balanced Druid is very entertaining because it can get pretty repetitive, or Marksmanship is very entertaining because it's pretty simple, but I can see the pros and cons. I can see some players just being fine with the way those specs work. However, Arcane is not one of them. So this is the state of Arcane that we touched on already on the speed of the specs and the classes, as well as the fun ratio, the fun factor of specs and classes. This is the absolute state of the casting situation for Arcane Mages. Now, I mentioned to you the biggest spammers of fillers being Frost Mage with Frostbolt, even for melee you had Rogues with Mutilate. Well, Arcane Missiles take the cake for every single spec in the game so far. You are going to be spending over 50% of your time clicking a single button. Not only that, but to make it even worse, this single button you are clicking is a channel. Channel abilities, I've already pointed this out before, are not fun. They are not entertaining. They don't make you feel good. When you're channeling Mind Flay, it's just about the worst moment for a Shadow Priest. If you're channeling Drain Soul, it also doesn't feel very good as a Warlock. The only time it feels good is if you're doing something huge. Is if you're playing with Decimating Bolt, if you are massively empowering your Drain Soul, in which case it can feel cool. It can feel cool if the channel you're using is, for example, Convoke the Spirits. Sure, that feels nice. But spending 55% of your time clicking Arcane Missiles is not fun. In and of itself, Arcane Missiles isn't that bad to use every once in a while. You can play, as many Arcane Mages are doing right now, you can play around it with a Legendary because many are playing with Arcane Harmony, so you do have, as mentioned in the fun factor of a spec, you do have a compelling element where you're using Arcane Missiles and you're seeing the Arcane Harmony stacks getting higher and higher, so you're anticipating getting to 18 stacks and launching off a very powerful Arcane Barrage. That feels cool, it feels like a nice end to your rotation. However, when your Arcane Missiles is being spammed for over half of your time playing the spec, it just devalues it a lot. It's like if your Warlock was spending 55% of its time casting Chaos Bolt. The coolness of being able to dump a bunch of Chaos Bolts because you correctly stockpiled your shards and you have enough haste to make it happen, it devalues the coolness of the ability a lot if you just spam it that often. Arcane Missiles is the same, it's not really that cool to use given the amount of time you're spamming it. I can applaud Blizzard for at the very least trying to change Arcane, because if you haven't kept track, Arcane was just like this before, except instead of having Arcane Missiles in this situation, you had Arcane Blast. So you were doing just about the same thing, except that now, instead of casting Arcane Blast, you are channeling Arcane Missiles, but the rest remains the same. Too much time spent playing Arcane Missiles. Yes, Blizzard was able to change the way the spec works, but you still have this very niche, this very weird situation where You have now been given a finisher because you have arcane charges getting consumed by arcane barrage. However, you still have this weird situation where Arcane Blast still keeps doing increased damage and costing more mana, so your finisher gets devalued by Arcane Blast to the point where your finisher isn't even in your top 2 or top 3 worthwhile abilities to use, and this has plagued Arcane Mage for a long time. So I think it's time for a rework. I think it's time to give up this whole Arcane Blast being a niche special thing. If it worked in a nice way, if it worked in a satisfying way, maybe it would be good. Maybe it would be a cool spec to play. It would be a satisfying spec to play. But I can't tell you if it would be, because it never happened. It's always been fucking boring and disappointing to play. So it's time to give up this hipsterness and turn it into a more enjoyable spec to play. Now, the last of the specs that I left behind is a non-DPS spec. Now, is it a tank? No, I don't think tanks need or require any massive overhaul. Vengeance is doing fine. Brewmaster, I think, plays very nicely. I think Blood Decay, despite the current weakness, still has a lot of ways to play the spec, a lot of cooldown, a lot of different choices you can have within the spec. It's very, I guess you can call it very difficult to play, or you can say very rewarding to play because of the decisions you have to go through compared to other tank specs. I think Guardian Druid is sort of hinging towards the a little bit more boring side and repetitive side because they don't have as many things to go through, but in Mythic Plus they can free their skill expression by off healing or off DPSing with their plethora of utility and other things they can do. So I still think that's an acceptable style for a tank. And then you have the prot tanks, Paladin and Warrior, which I think Paladin is doing fine, and Warrior lost a little bit after the band-aid changes being lost at the end of BFA into Shadowlands, but I don't think it's in need of a rework. It's in need of an overhaul, a polish. It just needs a little bit of help, which doesn't warrant being completely changed. The one I'm talking about is a healer spec. I'm talking about a healer spec because we have to address Holy Paladin. So, Mistweaver, yes, it's weak and nobody's playing it, but no, I don't think nobody's playing it because it is bad to play. Mistweaver is in fact pretty fun to play, pretty engaging to play. Unfortunately, the numbers are low, and some of the abilities that should be more powerful, like Essence Font for the raid healing, are just too weak, not to mention the mana issues of the spec. So that is not something that needs a rework, that is not something that needs an overhaul, it just needs tuning. Holy Priest has in fact improved tier after tier, expansion after expansion. I think now they are at the best situation, the best spot they have been in for quite a few tiers. So go Holy Priest, you're doing just fine. Discipline has continued being the same thing as they have been for a while now. They have gotten obscene with the release of Spirit Shell. Who could have predicted this? Just like anyone who remembers Spirit Shell from Mists. Now it's getting nerfed multiple times, it's expected, but the spec as a whole still works just fine. Restoration Shaman and Restoration Druid, the same. We only have the problem of Holy Paladin. The problem of Holy Paladin is of course that they are a spec that is forced to do damage to heal. Not in the same way as a Discipline Priest, which does it in a single big window with Atonement, with Spirit Shell all together at the same time, and then as a down phase, a cooldown phase, not in the same way as a Mistweaver, who has to specifically go for talents and specifically go for legendaries to make fist weaving a effective thing. Holy Paladin has it ingrained in their toolkit. The Crusader Strike, together with the talent Crusader's Might to reduce the cooldown of Holy Shock, together with the talent Glimmer of Light, together with Shock Barrier, all together with the extra additions of things like Wings, being able to also use Hammer of Wrath, it gives them a lot of damage. This is a problem because healer damage has become more and more important. It's become pretty helpful in raid encounters and extremely helpful in Mythic Plus keys, to the point where entire ratings, entire tiers of quality of healers can be decided by how much damage you can do in Mythic Plus. And no, I don't want for the Holy Paladin to quit this style. I don't want for Holy Paladin to go back to the boomer style of Paladin hard casting Holy Light and Flash of Light. All I'm saying is that right now Holy Paladin is a healer with no breaks. They have no mana neutral or mana positive plays. Essentially they have no cooling down phases. They have no chill and cast a healing wave, maybe a Riptide here and there. You know, they have no just spam smite forehead styles like Discipline Priest, which even then is not that strong, but Holy Paladin has to go at all times. Has to keep the pedal on the accelerator at all times. They have to keep using Crusader Strike because they have to keep using Holy Shock, because they have to keep generating Glimmers of Light, etc, etc, etc. And Blizzard is trying to fix this problem. In a debatable way, they are nerfing this build. They are nerfing the mana cost of your Crusader Strike. They are making your damage weaker. At the same time, they are trying to power up your Infusion of Light passive. They are trying to power up the strength of your Flesh and Holy Lights to make them more appealing for you to hard cast. So my wish for Holy Paladin isn't to be reworked like the other specs I mentioned, like Arcane Mage or Survival Hunter or Assassination Rogue. My wish is more of a light note. It's more of a trying to make hard casting for Holy Paladin a feasible way of playing, not even as a different style. This is something, if you haven't kept track, if you don't remember, in the beta Blizzard was trying to actually make both of the hardcast style and the melee DPS style of Holy Paladin work, and then gave up on the hardcast because nobody cared. Everyone just kept going for damage. My hope would be more on mana conservation. My hope would be more on making the judgments and the Crusader Strikes, maybe even the Holy Shock, although that's a little bit more problematic. Make it cost more mana, make it more important to use, because you're going to be spending more mana when you do, so that you only want to use it at the most important times of a phase, of a damage phase. When you are not in those phases, you don't need to keep the foot on the pedal, you don't need to keep accelerating, you can slow down, you can move to the Holy Light, you can move to hard casting, costing less mana, maybe even giving you some mana regen elements, something like Power Word Solace for priests, you know, some hard casted ability that can allow you to regen mana, hard casting, and then you can switch back into melee DPS, switch back into doing damage during a damage intensive phase you want to heal, and then switch back to hard casting. I think that would be much better for Holy Paladin. It would not make them as strong in doing damage because they would be spending more time hard casting, meaning their overall damage would also go down. It would put more importance in their damage phase. It would create some skill expression in the spec because you would have to choose the moment, the right moments to go in with your wings, with your judgments, with your Hammer of Rats and your Crusader Strikes, because if you do it permanently, you're just gonna out of mana in 3 minutes, which you think this is unfair, but this is exactly what happens to a Mistweaver Monk or a Discipline Priest or a Holy Priest if they just keep spamming their abilities for 3 minutes. So I think that would be pretty good. It would be a pretty good change, because otherwise we're going to continue being in this issue where Holy Paladin has too much damage. And when you have that much damage, you can't explain the amount of HPS they have, the fact that they still have a damage reduction external like Aura Mastery, the fact that they have an immunity, that they can give other people immunities with Blessing of Protection. So it becomes a little bit too encompassing. They remain like too strong in too many areas of the healing repertoire. So I think this could be a tactful way of approaching the current problem that Holy Paladin has. Now that we have gone over through these specs I consider worthy of a rework, worthy of an update, how many of these specs are actually going through any sort of changes in 9.1? Well, the answer is 0. The answer is none. The only one that is being looked at slightly, as I mentioned, is Holy Paladin, with this attempted minor changes from Blizzard, giving a little bit more focus on the hard casting part of the spec. The others are not really getting any major overhauls so far in 9.1. There haven't been actually many, if any, changes for Feral, for Frost, for Assassination and Arcane and Survival effectively, so I basically curse them even more right now. But nevertheless, those are the specs I wish to see changed. Sooner or later, eventually, I would like to see them reworked a little bit. Especially when you consider that the last time we have had any of these major changes was in Legion. In Legion, we got the new class because we got Demon Hunter and we got the rework of Survival. So we've gone through the entirety of Legion and then the entirety of BFA and then the first part of Shadowlands, which is 2 1/4 of expansions without any major changes to the specs. So maybe it's time to get some overhauls, it's time to get some changes, some makeovers to the specs. Let me guys know which of the specs you think are in need of a overhaul. Maybe you're playing Warlock and you just want to see demonology change completely, or you're just too bored of destruction and you want to see completely gone and remade. Maybe you're a warrior and you're sick of the arms playstyle. Let me know which of the specs should get changed. We're gonna stop here for now. This video is too long already. So, thank you guys for watching the video. If you have enjoyed the video, remember as usual to subscribe, because if you don't, you should always remember as usual as well that I do know your address. So, see you guys soon, very likely tomorrow. We have gotten our first pause yesterday. After a month or so of videos, we will see each other likely tomorrow. And in the meantime, my biggest hope is still for survival. They need to revert it to a range DPS, or there is no hope.